The moment my son put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, you deserve a real break," I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt loved. I should have known then that something was wrong. Because in 63 years of living, I have learned one thing. When someone gives you exactly what you've always wanted, you'd better look at what they're taking while you're distracted. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm a retired high school history teacher from Columbus, Ohio. I taught for 31 years. I coached debate for 20 of those years. I raised 2 children mostly on my own after my wife passed from ovarian cancer when my son was 11 and my daughter was 8. I worked double shifts in summers. I missed vacations. I clipped coupons until my fingers were stained with newsprint ink. I did everything a father is supposed to do, and then some. My son grew up fine, I thought. He married a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law, and she was polished, the kind of polish that takes a lot of effort to maintain. She had opinions about furniture and wine and the right neighborhoods, and my son slowly started having those same opinions too. I noticed it but said nothing. That's what fathers do. We notice and say nothing, and hope it works out. When I retired, I was 61. My pension was modest, but enough. I had a small house with a paid-off mortgage, a little savings, and some life insurance that my wife and I had taken out together decades before. Not rich, but comfortable. My son knew the numbers. He'd helped me organize my paperwork after I had a minor health scare 2 years ago. Nothing serious, a blood pressure episode that sent me to the ER for one night. And after that, he became very interested in what I had and where I kept it. I told myself it was concern. I told myself that's what good sons do. The trip came up in April. My son called on a Sunday evening and said he'd been talking to my daughter-in-law, and they both agreed I needed to get away. "You've been cooped up in that house since winter, Dad. You need sun. You need the ocean. You need to just breathe for a while." He said they'd found a cruise, 2 weeks, leaving from Miami, stopping in Jamaica, Grand Cayman, and Cozumel. He said he'd already booked it as an early birthday present. I turned 64 in June. I was moved. I actually got a little choked up on the phone. I said, "Son, you didn't have to do that." He said, "You did everything for us. Let us do something for you." I spent the next 2 weeks excited in a way I hadn't been in years. I bought new sunscreen. I found my old snorkeling mask in a box in the garage. I called my daughter, who lives in Portland, and told her about the trip. She seemed happy for me, though looking back, she was quieter than usual. She said, "That's nice, Dad," a few times, and changed the subject. The week before I was supposed to leave, I stopped by my son's house to pick up the printed itinerary he'd mentioned. He wasn't home. My daughter-in-law said he was at a work thing, but she handed me a folder with the cruise documents and said everything I needed was inside. That night I sat at my kitchen table and went through the folder carefully. Force of habit from 30 years of teaching, I read everything: the boarding pass, the cabin assignment, the excursion options, and then I saw it. The return transportation section was blank, not empty in a way that suggested it would be filled in later, blank in the way of a document where that field simply did not apply. I looked at the ticket again. One-way passage. Miami to Cozumel, final port of call. No return segment. I sat very still for a long moment. I am a history teacher. I have spent my career explaining to teenagers how things go wrong, how people miss the signs, how reasonable people convince themselves the unlikely is impossible right up until it isn't. I sat at my kitchen table at 10:15 on a Tuesday night, and I understood with a cold and terrible clarity that I was looking at a sign. I didn't call my son. I didn't call anyone. I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark, and I let my mind do what it does best. I organized the information. I thought about the past 2 years, the sudden interest in my paperwork, the questions about my life insurance beneficiary, just making sure it's updated, Dad, in case anything happens. The way my daughter-in-law had started calling me more often, asking how I was feeling, asking whether I was sleeping well. The health scare that had sent my son into a flurry of concerned phone calls that lasted about 3 weeks and then stopped completely. And then I thought about something else. 3 months ago, I had run into an old colleague of mine, a man I'll call my former colleague, at the grocery store. He'd retired from the school district the same year I did, but he'd gone on to do some private consulting work. Security consulting, he called it. Background research. The kind of work that involves knowing how to find things out. We'd had coffee twice since that grocery store run-in. He was sharp. He was discreet. And that night, lying in the dark thinking about a one-way cruise ticket, I thought about him. I called him at 7 the next morning. I told him I needed a favor and I needed it quiet. I told him about the ticket. He didn't say much. He said, "Give me 48 hours." What he found in those 48 hours changed everything. My son had consulted with an estate attorney 4 months ago. Not just any consultation, a specific inquiry about the process of having an elderly parent declared mentally incompetent. He had asked about timelines. He had asked about conservatorship. He had asked, according to the attorney's intake notes, that my former colleague obtained through channels I did not ask about, whether there were situations in which a parent could be placed in a care facility without their explicit consent if sufficient medical documentation existed. The attorney had apparently declined to proceed further with that line of conversation, and the meeting had ended, but it had happened. It was documented, and my son had not mentioned it to me. There was more. My daughter-in-law had been in contact with a man whose name I won't use, but who had a history that included 2 prior fraud convictions and a dismissed charge related to elder financial abuse. They had exchanged messages, not many, but enough. My former colleague showed me printed records, and I read them at his kitchen table, with my hands very steady, which surprised me because my chest felt like someone had parked a truck on it. The messages didn't spell anything out directly, but the pieces were there. And when you've spent 30 years teaching people to read between the lines of history, you learn that the absence of explicit statement is not the same as the absence of intent. I went home. I packed my bag for the cruise. I know that sounds strange, but I had a plan now, and the plan required me to get on that ship. My former colleague had spent the second 48 hours helping me with the other part. I updated my will. I moved certain documents. I made a phone call to a family law attorney in Columbus, whose name I'd found through the State Bar Association. I gave my daughter in Portland a sealed envelope and told her to open it only if she didn't hear from me within 21 days. She asked me what was going on. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but that I loved her and that everything was going to be okay. She said, "Dad, you're scaring me." I said, "I'm not scared. Not anymore." That was true. The fear had lasted about 6 hours the first night. After that, it became something else, something quieter and harder. Purpose, maybe. The same feeling I used to get before a difficult parent-teacher conference, where you know the conversation is going to be uncomfortable, and you go in anyway because it's the right thing to do. I flew to Miami on a Thursday. My son drove me to the airport. He hugged me at the curb and said, "Have the time of your life, Dad." I hugged him back. I looked at his face for a long moment, the face of the boy I had raised, the boy I had read to and coached and sat next to in the ER when he broke his collarbone at 14, and I made myself remember it exactly as it was. "I will," I said, and I meant it. The ship was enormous. I'd never been on a cruise before, and the scale of it was genuinely startling, like a small city that happened to float. They boarded us in waves, and I found my cabin, which was a small interior room 2 decks below the pool level. Fine. I wasn't there for luxury. I was in the dining room that first evening when I noticed the man at the table to my left. He was about my age, maybe a few years older. He was eating alone, which I recognized immediately because I was eating alone, and there's a specific kind of posture that solo diners develop, a slight inward turn of the shoulders, a careful attentiveness to the food that serves as a substitute for conversation. He had silver hair cropped short, a tan that suggested he spent real time outdoors rather than in a tanning booth, and he was reading a paperback novel that he kept having to put down to eat, which told me he was genuinely absorbed in it and not just using it as a prop. He caught me looking and nodded. I nodded back. That was enough. By the second day, we had exchanged small talk over breakfast. He told me his name was Edmund. He'd been a civil engineer. His wife had passed 2 years ago, and his children, he had 3, had pooled together to send him on this cruise as a gift. He said it with a warmth I recognized, the warmth of someone who genuinely believed the gift was given in love. I was careful about what I said. My former colleague had been explicit. Be cautious. Trust no one completely. Your being on this ship is not a coincidence from their perspective, and you don't know yet what else has been arranged. But Edmund was easy to be around in the way that some people simply are. He didn't push. He didn't ask probing questions. He talked about engineering the way I talked about history, as something he genuinely loved, not just done for money. He had a dry sense of humor and a habit of pausing before he spoke, which I associated with people who had spent a lot of time in rooms where the wrong word could cause serious problems. On the third day, I told him a small piece of the truth. I didn't tell him everything. I told him I had reason to believe my trip had been arranged with purposes other than my enjoyment, and that I was on the ship because I needed to be, not because I wanted to be. I watched his face as I said it. He didn't look surprised. He looked thoughtful. He put down his coffee and said, "How can I help?" That was the moment I decided I could trust him. Not fully, not blindly, but enough. He had a smartphone newer than mine and faster fingers, and he told me carefully, some experience with documentation from his years of work on public infrastructure contracts. He knew how to build a paper trail. He knew what constituted evidence and what didn't. And he had, unlike me, no personal stake in the outcome that might cloud his judgment. Over the next 4 days, we worked quietly. My former colleague had given me a secure email address and a schedule for check-ins. Through that channel, I continued receiving information. The man my daughter-in-law had been in contact with had a history that now included, through my former colleague's research, a connection to a scheme involving a life insurance policy and a death that had been ruled accidental. The investigation had been closed, but the connection was there. I printed nothing on the ship's business center. I wrote nothing down in a way that could be found. Edmund helped me organize the information in my memory, which is still good. 30 years of teaching AP history gives you a certain capacity for retaining and sequencing facts. We went over everything each evening after dinner, quietly, in one of the outdoor deck areas, where the wind made it difficult for anyone nearby to hear. On the 7th day, I received a message from my former colleague that changed the pace of everything. He had found a flight, booked in my son's name, Miami, arriving the day after the ship's final port of call in Cozumel. The purpose of the flight was not explained in the booking itself, but combined with everything else, the pattern was complete enough. My son intended to be in the vicinity of Cozumel on the day the cruise ended. I had a one-way ticket, and there was a man with a history of involvement in a suspicious death who had been in contact with my daughter-in-law. I am not a dramatic person. I don't sensationalize. I spent 30 years teaching students not to overstate their conclusions beyond what the evidence supports. The evidence supported a conclusion I did not want to state. I called the number my attorney had given me before I left Columbus. I also contacted the ship security office, not the staff member at the desk, but the head of security, whose name I had obtained through the guest services directory. I asked for a private meeting. I brought Edmund with me. The meeting lasted 2 hours. The head of security was a woman in her 50s, quiet and professional, who had clearly heard stranger things in her career and was not rattled by what I presented. She made calls. She involved the ship's captain. By the end of the evening, the information had been passed to law enforcement contacts in Florida through channels I don't fully understand, but was grateful existed. Edmund sat beside me through all of it and said almost nothing, which was exactly right. His presence was the kind that steadies a room without drawing attention to itself. Afterward, when we were back on the deck with the water black and flat around us and the lights of the ship reflected in it, he said, "You did well in there. I had a good teacher," I said. He looked at me. "My wife," I said. "She never let me back down from anything I knew was right, even when it was hard. 40 years of that kind of influence tends to stick." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mine too." We stayed out there for a long time without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. The final days of the cruise passed in a state of suspended waiting. I went on the excursions. I swam in the ocean for the first time in years, and I was surprised by how good the cold water felt against my skin. I ate food I couldn't name and liked most of it. I watched the sun set over the Caribbean twice and let myself simply look at it, which is something I don't do enough. Just look at beautiful things without immediately moving on. Edmund and I played cards after dinner the last 2 nights. He won both times, which I suspected was not entirely accidental, and I told him so, and he smiled the smile of a man who does not confirm or deny strategic card playing at sea. When the ship docked in Miami on the 14th day, there were people waiting. Not for me, or rather, not only for me. There were officials of a kind whose exact designation I was not informed of in the moment. I was brought to a private area, and I sat for several hours answering questions and providing documentation that my former colleague had already largely arranged. It was tedious and necessary, and I was very glad to have everything organized in the way that it was. My son was taken into custody at the Miami airport at approximately the same time I was sitting in that room. His flight had landed 40 minutes earlier. My daughter-in-law was interviewed at our home in Columbus. The man she had been in contact with was located in Clearwater. The exact nature of what was planned. What would have happened had I simply gotten off that ship in Cozumel as a confused elderly tourist with no return ticket was never stated to me outright, but the shape of it was clear enough that I didn't need the statement. My daughter flew in from Portland. She arrived at the hotel where I'd been put up for the night looking like she hadn't slept, which she hadn't. She sat across from me at the small table in the room and said, "Why didn't you tell me more before you left?" "Because I didn't want you to worry," I said, "and because I needed you to be surprised. They would have noticed if you weren't." She thought about that. Then she reached across the table and held my hand with both of hers, the way she used to when she was small, and she didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. There are things I still don't talk about easily. The fact that I looked at my son's face at the airport curb and didn't show what I knew. The fact that somewhere in the part of me that will always be his father, I had held on to a small and irrational hope that I was wrong, that there was an explanation for the one-way ticket, for the attorney consultation, for all of it, that I simply hadn't found yet. I had packed that hope in my bag alongside the sunscreen and the snorkeling mask, and I had carried it with me for 2 weeks. I wasn't wrong. There was no other explanation. But I was alive, and I had watched 2 Caribbean sunsets. And I had played cards with a man named Edmund who cheated subtly and well, and who called me 3 weeks after we got home to say he was thinking of driving through Columbus sometime in the fall if I'd be interested in lunch. I said I would be. My former colleague stopped by the week after I got back, and I made us both coffee, and we sat on my porch and didn't talk much about the details. He said, "You handled it right." I said I'd had help. He said, "That's what help is for. My daughter calls me every Sunday now. We've started planning a trip, a real one we choose together, with return tickets." She found a small ship expedition cruise to Alaska and sent me the brochure in the mail, which is the kind of thing she knows I appreciate. Paper. Something you can hold. I still live in the same house. The mortgage has been paid off for 6 years. There's a vegetable garden in the back that I've been neglecting and intend to fix. My neighbor's dog has developed a habit of sitting at my fence and watching me drink my morning coffee, which I find pleasant company. I think about my son. I think about the boy he was and the man he became, and the place where those 2 things diverged, which I have gone over many times trying to find whether there was something I missed or something I could have changed. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe no one does. Maybe some paths diverge for reasons that have nothing to do with what you did or didn't do, and the most honest thing you can say is, "I did my best, and it wasn't enough to prevent this, and I am still here. I am still here." That's not a small thing. At 63 years old, with a paid-off house and a vegetable garden I need to tend, and a man named Edmund who cheats at cards, and a daughter who sends me brochures in the mail, it is not a small thing at all. The detective who handled my case called me last month to update me on the proceedings. Before he hung up, he said, "Mr.," and then he used my name, and he said, "For what it's worth, I've been doing this 20 years. Most people in your position don't figure it out in time. The fact that you did, that took something." I thought about what to call that something. Intelligence, maybe. Caution. Experience. 30 years of teaching people to read what's actually on the page instead of what they want to see. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the habit of a man who has been reading documents carefully his whole life, sitting down one ordinary Tuesday night with a folder full of travel papers and actually reading them, said. I said, "I was a history teacher. We learned to look for the things people try to leave out." He laughed a little. He said good luck to me. I thanked him. And I meant that too.